It starts with a morning that's so normal it almost feels insulting. Alarm goes off. You silence it. Coffee, same kitchen, same tired eyes in the mirror. And then before you even open email, before you even look at the weather, you reach for your phone, not to buy anything, not to plan some big move, just to check the number. Not because you're excited, because you're making sure nothing collapsed overnight. And if you've done that, if you've ever checked your balance just to feel your shoulders drop half an inch, you already know what this is about. Now picture this. You're driving to work, same route, same traffic, and your car makes a sound it's never made before. Not a dramatic sound, nothing that screams tow truck, just a weird little knock, a faint grind, something off. But your brain doesn't hear a weird sound. Your brain hears sequence, transmission. That's a few thousand. If it's not the transmission, it's tires. If it's not tires, it's brakes. And if this lands in the same month as your credit card due date, and the dentist, and that random medical bill that always shows up 2 weeks late, you're not even worried about the car. You're worried about the timing. Because you're living in a rhythm where one small thing doesn't stay small. It stacks. It crowds the calendar. It corners your next decision. And here's the part that messes with you. Same sound, same person, same exact situation, but there are people who hear that noise and they don't spiral. Not because they're reckless, not because they're rich, not because they don't care. They care, they just don't panic. They pause, they notice it, they think, okay, I'll get it checked the way someone thinks about a broken light bulb. And what's wild is, from the outside, you'd never know why. Their life doesn't look dramatically different. They still work. They still have bills. They still complain about traffic like everyone else. But they have something you can't see in a photo. Distance. Distance between a problem showing up and their nervous system hitting the red button. And here's the uncomfortable truth. That distance usually doesn't show up at 100 grand. It often shows up around $20,000. 20,000, not a flex, not a I made it number, not even remotely impressive by internet standards. But it's enough to make life operate differently at the decision level. It doesn't buy you a new lifestyle. It buys you a different internal tempo. And if that sounds dramatic, good, because it is. Because the real question isn't, how much money do you have? The real question is, how does your brain behave the moment something goes slightly wrong? And if you've ever checked your balance just to feel okay for a second, you already know why this matters. You just might not know yet why 20,000 changes it more than almost any other milestone. So here's the part that doesn't make sense on paper. Why is it that having 5 grand saved or 10 grand saved can actually make you more anxious than having 0? Why does the same cash in the bank that's supposed to calm you down somehow turn into this thing you guard, like it's fragile, like it could disappear if you even look at it wrong? And why does 20,000 do something totally different? Not in a that's more money way, in a your sleep changes way. How does one number make you stop doing midnight disaster math and start treating problems like problems instead of threats? And how is it possible that 2 people can work the same job, live in the same city, have the same bills, but the person with around 20,000 suddenly starts acting differently? They negotiate harder. They say no faster. They fix the car early instead of praying the noise goes away. They walk away from a bad deal without writing a 3-paragraph apology. And they're not doing it because they got rich. Half the time their income didn't even change. So what actually changed? Was it the bank balance? Or was it the way their brain processes risk the moment life gets slightly inconvenient? Because if 20,000 is doing all of that, then it's not really buying security in the way people think. It's buying something else. And once you see what it's buying, if you really name it, you start realizing why the smaller milestones can feel like quicksand. They don't feel like progress. They feel like higher stakes. Which leads to the real question we have to answer before any of this makes sense. If 20,000 isn't wealth, What is it actually purchasing? So let's name the thing we're actually talking about here, because this is where most people get lost. This isn't about saving, it's not about being rich or poor, and it's definitely not about hitting some impressive number. What we're talking about is a decision buffer, a gap between a problem showing up and you having to react immediately. $20,000 isn't magic. It doesn't protect you from everything. It doesn't mean life stops throwing surprises at you. What it does very consistently is move you out of reaction mode. Before that point, most people live on a financial conveyor belt. Money comes in, money goes out, everything technically works, bills get paid, nothing collapses. But there's no distance, no margin, no pause, and without that pause, you don't really have choices, you just have timing. That's the real issue. Most working adults aren't stuck because they're bad with money. They're stuck because every decision is rushed. Every choice is made under pressure. And pressure slowly degrades decision quality in ways you don't notice until years later. When you're constantly reacting, you don't ask, is this the best move? You ask, can I survive this month? $20,000 is often the point where that question finally changes. Not because you suddenly have abundance, but because you finally have space. Space to think before you respond. Space to look at a problem without your nervous system hijacking the outcome. And that's the quiet shift most people miss. Being rich isn't about having more money. It's about having enough distance from risk that you're no longer forced to make fast decisions. The moment you understand that, the real question becomes unavoidable. If $20,000 functions as a buffer, what exactly does it change about the decisions you make when something goes wrong? I'll be honest, I used to roll my eyes at money milestones. 10,000, 20,000, 50, they always sounded like clean Instagram-friendly numbers people like to circle and celebrate. Not because they did anything, but because they looked good on a screenshot. And for a long time, that's what I thought they were. Just numbers people used to feel ahead. But then something kept bothering me. I kept watching people who weren't poor and weren't rich live like they were constantly one step away from slipping. Good jobs, decent income, nothing obviously wrong, and yet everything they did felt tight, defensive, reactive. And then every once in a while, I'd see someone cross roughly the same line, not exactly 20,000 to the dollar, but somewhere around there, and the story would change, not in a flashy way. No new car, no lifestyle upgrade. What changed was smaller than that. They stopped panicking over small things. They didn't spiral when a bill showed up early. They didn't overthink every purchase like it was a moral failure. And here's the part that made me pay attention. Once they stopped panicking over the small stuff, their decisions around the big stuff quietly improved. They negotiated instead of accepting. They fixed problems early instead of waiting for disasters. They walked away from bad deals without needing to justify it to themselves. Same person, same job, same world, different internal behavior. That's when it clicked for me. This wasn't a lifestyle milestone. It was a nervous system milestone, a point where people weren't suddenly better with money. They were just no longer operating in a constant state of threat. And that's why the number matters. Not because it's impressive, but because it's functional. Once you see that pattern repeat enough times, you stop asking whether the number is real. You start asking why it works. And whether that shift comes from money itself or from something happening inside the way the brain processes risk. Here's the part most people never zoom out far enough to see. Modern working adults don't feel tight because they're reckless spenders. They feel tight because their money lives on rails. Rent or a mortgage, insurance, car payments, student loans, subscriptions you barely remember signing up for, groceries, utilities. Everything is timed, everything is automatic, everything shows up whether life is calm or not. As long as you stay on the track, nothing explodes. Paychecks come in, payments go out, the machine runs, but the trade-off is subtle and brutal. There's no room to change direction. You're moving forward, but you can't step sideways. And systems love people like this. Someone with steady income, predictable obligations, and fixed monthly commitments is easy to model, easy to forecast, easy to monetize. You're not being pushed to buy yachts or designer watches. You're being nudged into small recurring yeses that feel harmless on their own. $10 here, 15 there, a convenience fee, a protection plan, a renewal you meant to cancel but didn't. None of it feels dramatic, but together they quietly eat the space between your income and your decisions. That's the real cost. You're not being drained by indulgence. You're being drained by automation. And when there's no distance between your obligations and your cash flow, every surprise becomes personal. Not because it's expensive, but because it threatens the rhythm. A broken appliance doesn't feel like a repair. It feels like a violation. A medical bill doesn't feel like an expense. It feels like a setback to your entire schedule. You're not scared of the problem itself. You're scared of what it collides with. Due dates, payment cycles, minimums, timing. That's why people say things like, I can't afford for anything to go wrong right now, even when they technically make decent money. It's not about discipline, it's about architecture. If your financial life is built as a series of automatic commitments, there's no buffer left for judgment. Everything becomes reactive. Everything becomes urgent. Everything feels closer than it should, which leads to the uncomfortable realization hiding under all of this. If the system is designed to eliminate distance, then $20,000 doesn't work by earning interest or beating inflation. It works by interrupting the system itself. And that raises the question we haven't answered yet. If that number creates distance in a structure designed to remove it, what exactly changes inside the way your brain responds once that distance finally exists? Here's the part most people quietly blame themselves for and shouldn't. When you don't have much buffer, your brain flips into scarcity mode. And scarcity isn't just about not having money, it's about not having options. When options disappear, the brain stops optimizing and starts surviving. That shift is subtle but brutal. In scarcity, your nervous system treats uncertainty like danger. You become hyper-alert to risk. Every decision gets filtered through one question. What could I lose? Not what's best, not what's efficient, just what keeps the floor from dropping out. That's why discipline alone doesn't fix this. There's a well-documented bias called loss aversion. Losing $500 hurts about twice as much as gaining $500 feels good. So when you've saved $5,000 or $10,000, your brain doesn't register safety. It registers exposure. You don't think I have protection. You think I finally have something to lose. Your emergency fund stops feeling like armor and starts feeling like a fragile object. You guard it. You watch it. You hesitate to touch it. Like a small flame in a windy room, you're not enjoying the warmth, you're worried about it going out. That's why people with modest savings often feel more anxious than people with nothing. At zero, you already know you're vulnerable. At 5 or 10,000, you feel responsible for keeping vulnerability from getting worse. Around 20,000, something changes. Not dramatically, not overnight. But the constant background alarm quiets down. The amygdala, the part of your brain that scans for threats, stops firing at everything. Not because risk disappears, but because the margin absorbs it. You still worry. You're still human. But you're no longer in a permanent defensive crouch. And when the fear volume drops, the prefrontal cortex finally gets some oxygen. That's the part of your brain that plans, weighs trade-offs, and thinks in sequences instead of snapshots. This is the part most advice misses. You can't out-discipline your own neurology when you're living at the edge of perceived threat. Willpower doesn't override biology. It just burns out inside it. Which leads to the question we have to answer next. If $20,000 quiets the fear enough to change how the brain operates, what decisions start to look different once you're no longer thinking in survival mode? This is where the real damage starts showing up. And it doesn't happen all at once. It layers. At first it's subtle. You delay small preventative costs. The car makes a noise, but it still runs. Your tooth hurts a little, but it's tolerable. Your laptop freezes, but you restart it and move on. Not because you're careless, because every dollar you spend feels like it's threatening the balance. So you wait. That's the first layer. Then waiting turns into cost. A $150 checkup becomes a $1,500 repair. A $1,500 repair becomes a $5,000 replacement. And here's the part people miss. You don't just lose money. You lose time. You lose energy. You lose confidence in your own judgment because now you're not thinking, I should have handled that earlier. You're thinking, I can't afford to make mistakes. That's the second layer. Then something else happens. You start avoiding risks that are actually good for you. You don't take the class. You don't explore the job change. You don't try the side project. You don't push back in negotiations. Not because you don't want more, because all of it requires a drop before it rises. And when you don't have a buffer, you can't tolerate the drop. That's the third layer. Eventually, life locks into survival rhythm. You stop thinking in years. You stop planning in chapters. You think in billing cycles, pay periods, due dates. Your mental timeline collapses inward. You're not failing, you're responding. And that's the most expensive part of all. Because living in survival mode doesn't just limit your options, it compounds bad outcomes. Every delayed fix costs more. Every avoided opportunity shrinks your future range. Every decision made under fear quietly taxes the years ahead. This is the cost people never put on a spreadsheet. Not interest, not fees, but the price of making choices while scared. Which is why the real question isn't whether $20,000 feels like a lot. The real question is whether it can save you from paying this hidden cost over and over for years. Here's where the illusion finally breaks. The problem isn't a single emergency. It's emergencies stacking on top of each other. That's the part people never calculate. Let's say you have $5,000 saved. An HVAC unit fails. $3,500. On paper, you handled it. You didn't go into debt. You were responsible. But look at what's left. $1,500. That number isn't neutral. It's not comforting. It's a trigger. Now every other expense in that month carries weight. Groceries feel heavier. Gas feels heavier. Any surprise, no matter how small, feels like it could tip you. So you tighten up, you delay things, you avoid decisions. That's how one incident turns into a cluster. Now take the exact same failure with $20,000, same $3,500, same pain, same annoyance, but this time it's 17.5%. It doesn't push you into panic territory. It doesn't collapse your margin. It doesn't change how you behave the next morning. The system stays intact, and that's the real math. $20,000 doesn't reduce the probability of things breaking. Life still happens. What it reduces is emotional amplification. How loud the event feels inside your head. Lower emotional volume leads to calmer decisions. Calmer decisions prevent secondary mistakes. Secondary mistakes are what actually make emergencies expensive. People think emergency savings are about paying for problems. They're not. They're about preventing you from becoming the worst version of yourself during the problem. The version that rushes, that delays the wrong things, that overreacts, that underreacts. That's why the number works. Not because it's impressive, but because it keeps you out of the psychological danger zone where one issue turns into 5. And once you see that, another question becomes unavoidable. If $20,000 is mostly buying decision quality, what's the real cost of living without it? Not this month, but over the next 10 years. Picture two people, same city, same job level, roughly the same paycheck. From the outside, they look identical. But under the surface, one difference keeps compounding. Person A has $3,000 to $8,000 set aside. Person B has around 20. Now watch what happens over time. When something breaks for person A, they buy the cheapest fix. Not because it's smart, because it's survivable. They pick the option with the lowest upfront cost, the shorter warranty, the delayed payment, the minimum due. It feels responsible in the moment, but cheap choices tend to be expensive later. The repair fails sooner, the interest shows up quietly, the late fee sneaks in, the opportunity passes because timing mattered. They think they're saving money. What they're really buying is stress and future cost. Now look at person B. Same problem, same inconvenience. But they can choose differently. They fix things early. They buy the version that lasts. They pay the deductible that lowers long-term premiums. They negotiate salary or walk away from a bad deal because 2 slow weeks won't collapse everything. Nothing dramatic, just better options. And that's the real opportunity cost people miss. It's not about missing out on some perfect investment return. It's about how panic quietly steals your future one decision at a time. Every rushed choice shrinks your next set of options. Every fear-based shortcut compounds forward. Person A keeps paying in installments, financial and psychological. Person B keeps paying once and moving on. Same income, same effort, different trajectories. Not because one is smarter, because one has distance. And once you see that, the uncomfortable question shifts again. If logic explains the gap this clearly, what emotional trap keeps people stuck just below it, even when they're doing everything right? There's a specific zone where a lot of people get stuck and they don't realize it has a name. It's the space between about $5,000 and $15,000. You're no longer broke. You're no longer in free fall. But you're also not stable. And that's what makes this zone so uncomfortable. You think you should feel safe, but you don't. In fact, many people feel more anxious here than when they had nothing. Because now there is something to lose. You can see the floor. You've built something small, and your brain becomes obsessed with protecting it. That's the anxiety plateau. In this zone, people start acting in ways that don't make sense from the outside. They won't spend money on prevention, but they'll pay high fees to delay payments. They won't invest in skills or health, but they'll spend to numb stress at the end of the day. They won't change jobs, but they'll stay exhausted by staying put. And then they blame themselves. They think they lack discipline. They think they're inconsistent. They think they're doing something wrong. But the problem isn't character, it's threshold. Their savings haven't crossed the line where the brain stops treating money like a fragile object and starts treating it like a foundation. So every decision feels tense. Every choice feels loaded. Every expense feels personal. This is the trap. You're close enough to safety to taste it, but not far enough from risk to relax. And here's the uncomfortable part. Systems love people on the anxiety plateau because anxious consumers are predictable consumers. And that leads directly into the final thing we need to look at: why this zone isn't an accident and who benefits from keeping people right here. Once you see the pattern, it gets uncomfortable fast. Because no one needs a conspiracy for this to work. They just need incentives. A consumer economy runs smoothly when most working adults don't have slack. When subscriptions renew without thought. When minimum payments feel like relief. When stress spending fills emotional gaps at the end of long weeks. If you don't have a buffer, you become a very cooperative customer. Credit companies don't need you to default. They need you to hover. Retail doesn't need you to be irresponsible. They need you tired enough to buy comfort. Employers don't need you desperate forever. They just need you cautious enough to avoid friction. And when you're operating without distance, yes becomes the default setting. Yes to overtime. Yes to the bad deal. Yes to the fee that makes it go away faster. Yes to the purchase that buys 5 minutes of calm. Not because you're weak, because urgency compresses choice. What makes this powerful is how normal it all feels. Everyone's busy, everyone's stretched, everyone's just getting by. That phrase, just getting by, isn't accidental. It's a social anesthetic. It turns a structural condition into a personality trait. It tells you this is adulthood, this is responsibility, this is normal. But here's the part the system can't tolerate. A person with a real buffer can pause. They can wait. They can say not now. They can ask for better terms. They can walk away and come back later. And real delay is dangerous to systems built on immediacy, because delay breaks momentum. It breaks emotional leverage. It breaks the urgency that keeps money moving in predictable loops. $20,000 doesn't overthrow anything. It doesn't opt you out of reality. It does something quieter and more disruptive. It gives you the right to hesitate. And in personal finance, hesitation isn't laziness, it's power. Which brings us to the only way this story can end. If a buffer buys you distance, decision quality, and the ability to delay, then the difference $20,000 makes isn't about lifestyle at all. It's about who's in control when life applies pressure. And that's the conclusion people miss until they feel it for themselves. So let's close this cleanly. Life doesn't change after you save $20,000 because you're suddenly protected from everything. You're not. No one is. Cars still break. Jobs still change. Health still surprises you. That's not the shift. The shift is that past this point you stop making decisions while flinching. You buy something rarer than security. You buy space. Space between a problem and a reaction. Space between fear and action. Space for your brain to stay online when something goes wrong. Before this point, a lot of people confuse fear with discipline. They tell themselves they're being careful, responsible, conservative. But most of the time, they're just tense. And tension doesn't produce good judgment over long periods of time. After this point, something quiet but permanent changes. You stop hoping nothing happens this month and start assuming you'll handle it if it does. That difference matters more than income, more than hustle, more than optimization, because decisions made without panic compound differently. $20,000 is the line between I can't afford mistakes and I can afford to be deliberate, between reacting fast and choosing well, between living inside urgency and stepping just far enough away from it. That's why this number matters, not because it's impressive, not because it's rich, but because it's stabilizing. It doesn't give you freedom, it gives you resistance. Resistance to bad timing, resistance to pressure, resistance to becoming the worst version of yourself when life applies force. And once your decision quality crosses that threshold, trajectories start to shift. Quietly, gradually, predictably. From there on, money becomes math. But before that, it's psychology. You're not chasing $20,000 to show anyone anything. You're chasing it to stop living in emergency mode. And if this clicked for you, the next step isn't harder, it's clearer. Because $10,000 creates the first real distance. And $50,000 changes how you play the game entirely. That's where this conversation goes next.